Today we will be looking at the failure of Operation Barbarossa and the ultimate stagnation of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, which would put the Germans on the defensive for virtually the remainder of the war. Now, as the Wehrmacht begins closing the various pockets formed by the Blitzkrieg, they run into some fairly new challenges. Now, despite High Command's optimism, General Bach was concerned with the increasingly poor condition of the Soviet roads, very stiff resistance, and he doubted that the taking of Minsk will be as decisive as the command thought it would be. He wished to push for Moscow, and Holt agreed, yet the operations continued largely as they were. Now, the T-34 and KV-1 tanks proved to be some fairly durable enemies, especially for Army Group North, who at the time had lacked Stuka dive bomber cover. Now, the 6th Panzer Group had been halted for 2 days at the Dubisa River by KV-1 and KV-2s, some of which, mind you, had actually run out of gas and just sat as these fairly impenetrable cannons. The Germans actually had to wheel up flak guns to destroy them. Now, Ewald von Kleist of the 1st Panzer Group considered the T-34 to be the best tank in the world, which should be telling you something given how famous the Germans were for their tank warfare and their tank tactics. Now, eventually, the Wehrmacht gets around to closing the Bialystok pocket under the control of Army Group Center. Now, Heinz Guderian at Wehrmacht would lead the pincer assault. Meanwhile, the Finland declared war on the USSR, all while Sweden would now allow Germans to move troops through its lands. Now, in command of the 47th Panzer Corps, it is known that General Joachim Lemelson actually protested the murder of Soviet civilians and POWs. So we see that not all of the German armed forces were on board with the ethnic destruction of the Slavs. And meanwhile, retreating commander Dmitry Pavlov and his staff were executed by Moscow for their cowardice. Now, another issue that the Wehrmacht ran into was the slow movement of Army Group South. Manstein's 41th Panzer Corps takes the Dvinsk and takes the rail crossings over the Dvina River, yet he had to end up waiting a week for the 16th Army to catch up. And because of this, Army Group South was moving very, very slowly, and the Soviets managed to hold their best men in the region. Soviet General Rokossovsky and his 9th Mechanized Corps held the Germans back for 2 whole days before they ended up taking Rovno. Now, this ends up to begin, it begs the question, should Hitler divert men from the center to the southern front? This would be a large question within the German command. Now, Zhukov gets Stalin's permission to develop 2 defensive lines to halt the Wehrmacht. So we're seeing that Zhukov and his fairly sophisticated officer corps, actually, who is now gaining valuable experience from the German offensive, is starting to set up their defense in depth tactics, which would end up halting the Germans during Operation Typhoon. Now, Leningrad up north prepares for Army Group North's attack and ends up building their defenses. All the while, Soviet partisans are working behind the lines to hurt the communication of the Wehrmacht. Ambushing trucks, destroying supplies, all of that. Meanwhile, most of this is done under the direction of Secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev. And it is in this period as well that the British intelligence managed to crack the German Enigma code, which would be instrumental in decoding numerous German commands, orders, and supply routes. Now, the Wehrmacht soon came to a dilemma over what to do with Army Group Center's strategic goals. Should the Panzers be diverted to seal the Minsk pocket, or should they be driven east to continue the Blitzkrieg? Well, the debate was mainly between von Kluge and Guderian. Now, Army Chief of Staff Franz Halder desired for Army Group Center to take Moscow, where Hitler wanted to take an upward movement into the Baltics. So we see that Army Group Center actually begins to stagnate. Now, the southern flank of this pocket, that is the Minsk pocket, severely taxed German strength. Numerous Red Army infantry end up escaping, and the signs of overextension were very obvious at this point. Meanwhile, Richard Surga, a Russian spy in Tokyo, manages to inform Moscow that Japan will not be attacking, meaning that the Siberian troops are able to move west to fight the Germans. Meanwhile, Army Group North takes Riga, while Army Group South takes Lvov and approaches Kiev. Heinz Guderian and Holtz become subordinates of Kluge's army, much to the dismay of Guderian, who famously did not like Kluge. Now, eventually, Army Group Center would assault towards Smolensk, and Heinz Guderian would take the area around Mogilev. Smolensk is invaded by the spearheads, yet the infantry is far behind the motorized groups. Guderian then refuses to close the pocket, being more of a proponent of blitzkrieg tactics, and instead heads for the high ground near Yelna. This allows the Soviets to escape the pocket. Meanwhile, Army Group North continues towards Leningrad, yet unfortunately they must continue moving east as well to cover Army Group Center's northern flank. Meanwhile, Franz Halder is seriously beginning to doubt, really dislike Hitler's interference. There are some in the command structure at this point who, although they had been in agreement with Hitler early on, are really starting to feel like he's bungling the operation. And of course, worst of all is the talk of, and then orders on Hitler's part for moving Guderian's panzers south and Hutt's north. This is seen as extremely futile and dangerous by Kluge and Bach, who claim that they would lose their effectiveness if not deployed in unison via concentrated panzer spearheads. The infantry force ended up attacking towards Moscow during Operation Typhoon, and the infantry entered vicious deadlock. Now, the Smolensk pocket was closed with very high difficulty, and the Soviet counteroffensives inflicted enormous casualties. Army Group South, meanwhile, would end up taking Kiev and capturing the Crimea. Now, the winter of 1941 became a hellish situation for the Germans. Now, the freezing temperatures froze the lubricants in German vehicles, which often did not start when they had to, hindering the effectiveness of the panzer groups, and numerous firearms and other equipment faced similar issues. The offensive very quickly halted in place into a deadlock. It did not help the Germans that T-34s tended to have wider treads, which better handled the conditions. Now, the Germans did eventually close the Bryansk and Vyazma pockets, yet Zhukov's defenses on the Mohysk-Kalinin line end up halting the Germans just shy of Moscow. Now, the Germans at this point had exhausted their reserves and their supplies, and many of their trucks and tanks were stuck in the mud. Following the rainy fall season, the winter had brought really a hellish freezing to all the poor equipment that the Germans had brought. Mind you, the Blitzkrieg was supposed to be a quick offensive to take Moscow before winter, so it was not in the German high command's planning to have proper winter equipment. This, of course, would come to haunt them, especially since the Soviet counteroffensives nearly destroyed the entire cohesion of the German lines. Army Group Center was forced away from Moscow, quite far, actually. But Hitler, in Directive Number 39, forces Army Group Center to stay and fight. And, the offensive was a catastrophe. Operation Typhoon failed. And, of course, Guderian, Bach, and Brauchitsch were all relieved of command by Hitler. Now, I would like to take a look at some final notes on Barbarossa's failure. In retrospect, what were some of the major flaws that led to the ultimate failure of the operation? Well, first we have Army Group Center's twin encirclements at Bryansk and Vyazma, which used up troops that were needed to push on Moscow. This, of course, blunted the panzer spearheads, and Army Group Center lost its momentum. The diversion of Heinz Guderian's panzers to take Kiev, and then his failure to capture Tula or properly pincer Moscow, ensured Typhoon's failure. Bach was completely in shock over this situation, particularly of Hitler's perceived incompetence. Now, command refused to use precious transport vehicles for winter clothing, as it implied Typhoon would last over the winter. The Germans would suffer tremendously. The logistical burdens of the supply as well were a huge issue. Shortages of men and resources, and the vastly reduced operational capabilities of the Wehrmacht, particularly in Army Group Center alongside the blunted panzer heads, allowed the Soviets to stall them permanently. And while the Germans would make a couple more offensives throughout the war, the failures here, and especially at Stalingrad, would permanently put them on the defensive for the rest of the war. And I would like to point out that the siege of Leningrad would never be a success for the Germans either. They would devastate the city, and yet Army Group North would never take Leningrad or properly encircle it.